Yeah, there were a lot of times like that. I think the most concentrated for me was in the desert Southwest. I find that to be a very special place. And I love riding in the desert Southwest at night, which like people on tour, I know some people don't like to ride in the dark, but when you're out there and you can see like stars from the ground all the way to stars on the ground and you're watching like the Milky Way move through the night, I love that. Like my ride out of Big Bend was the same thing. It was a day where I got like 4 flats or something like that. So it just took forever. So I ended up getting to camp at like 2 a.m. The last like 4 hours were just me completely alone. Like I think like 2 cars went by. Otherwise it was just, high desert plains. And yeah.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Spencer McCullough. Spencer's bike adventure took him up, down, and all around the USA as he became the first person to cycle to all 51 national parks in the lower 48 states. Now, the catalyst for this journey came when Spencer read an article that told of the risk to so many of these national parks being irreparably damaged or lost due to climate change. So much natural beauty lost forever. He began to think about how much change his own grandparents had seen in their lifetime, and then got to thinking about what it would be like to miss out seeing all of that grandness and beauty contained within each national park because he waited too long and couldn't get there in time to see them. So what did Spencer do? Well, he got to plotting out a route and worked out the best way to connect them all up in one single journey. This would be monumental. He set off in April 2023, and some 411 days later, having pedalled over 29,000 kilometres, Spencer rolled into Acadia, park number 51 on his list, having successfully completed this adventure. Now, since finishing up this trip, Spencer hasn't let up. Instead, he's been drawing on many of his own experiences from embarking on such a thorough tour through the US, and has now begun documenting all the hiker-biker campsites in America on a website he's created called gobikecamping.com. I can't wait to learn more about this and to dig into Spencer's story, to learn more about this journey and hear his insights from taking such an incredible trip. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to dig into your story, Spencer. I can't wait to learn about all these parks in the US and your experiences. I'm a very visual person. I'm a lover of landscapes. So personally, I think you're going to give me a massive dose of wanderlust as we dig into the details of your trip. But Spencer, a question I start my show with, and I ask it of all my guests, is, Spencer, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
Yeah, I don't know what brand it was or what model, but it was blue and it had those pedal back coasting brakes. And I grew up in New York City and my grandparents lived across the river in New Jersey. So we would sometimes take it out to their place and ride it around in the cul-de-sac there or ride it around in like Central Park. Those were sort of my earliest memories of a bicycle.
Oh, wow. Have you ridden much in Central Park since, like as an adult? Have you been to Central Park and ridden around?
No, not really.
I asked that as riding around Central Park for some reason seems to be something on my bucket list. I don't know where that's even come from, but the back pedal coaster brakes, I had back pedal brakes on my BMX actually. Every now and then I often wonder what it'd be like braking with my foot again instead of my hands, but you get an insight into the era that someone grew up with by the answer to what bike they had as well, which is quite cool. Now, did you continue riding bikes as you grew up, or were bikes just sort of like an incidental thing?
No, I rode bikes up until I got my driver's license, in high school, and then I was driving to school, and that was the cool kid thing to do. Then when I went to college, I didn't have a car, so I rode my bike everywhere. And then when I moved to Colorado, I didn't have a car when I first moved here, so I bought a bike and rode that everywhere. And that's pretty much been my primary mode of transportation. Even though there have been periods where I have owned a car, it doesn't get driven that often.
Put my hand up as nearly having a similar sort of experience. As an Aussie, I grew up riding bikes as a kid, but as soon as you learn to drive, you sort of stop riding bikes. It's sort of a shared theme there with very car-centric nations.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also now just a full-time commuter. My only form of transport is a bike. It takes a little bit of adjustment, doesn't it? Like, did you adjust to it well? Or, like, from being the cool kid, as you call it, to driving around to not having a car to drive?
Yeah, I always liked riding my bike, and I drove like a pretty beat up minivan. I wasn't exactly a cool kid driving. It felt like I drove because everything was so far away. But now that I was at my parents' house for a little bit with more of a bike mindset, I was riding to a lot of these places that I always drove to, and I was like, these places aren't that far away. I could have ridden my bike to all of them. It's just like the roads are incredibly hostile in between those two spots. And so it doesn't really occur to you that you could ride there.
I now live in France, and one thing that makes riding to places such a pleasure is the lack of hostility on the roads, especially in the area of France where I live in.
Yeah.
I'm treated as a human when I'm on my bike. I'm not treated as someone that's in the way.
Yeah, like if I had wanted to ride my bike to the high school, I would have had to cross this like 6-lane road at this like pretty messed up intersection that is just, yeah, not a pleasant place to be. And I do it now because I'm much more confident and comfortable on my bike. And the intersection doesn't last very long. And on both sides of that, the roads are pretty manageable. But as a kid, in my mind, it never occurred to me that I could ride my bike past this point because it just seemed so aggressive.
It's really intimidating to someone to begin when that's what they're faced with as well. Like, to get over that idea of, I could make this journey. It doesn't matter if the distance is quite small. If there's these huge barriers, especially a perceived barrier to safety, it stops them from even trying in the beginning.
Right. Yeah. And so now it's funny because being back, I was riding to all the places I would normally drive because I couldn't be bothered to get in the car. It only took me like 15 minutes longer to ride my bike here than it did to drive. Like, it's not that big of a deal.
It so makes sense. And there's times also, I definitely get it when I'm doing like the grocery commute. And bear in mind, I live in a very tiny area in France in terms of population size as well. But there are times where I'm riding into the main town and the cars are backed up and I'm just sort of quite happily whizzing by in the bike lane.
Oh, yeah.
There is that awesome feeling, isn't there, when you do that?
Yeah. I get that a lot in Denver now because it can get pretty congested back here. Yeah, riding my bike is not usually that much longer than driving. You don't have to deal with the hassle of parking and, all that other nonsense. It's quite nice.
Growing up, you mentioned there you grew up in New York City. Were vacations with family and stuff? Did your family, explore sort of outdoor areas and stuff for vacations growing up as a kid? Growing up in such a huge city, like did you have a thirst for the outdoors?
My dad grew up on a farm in like rural North Carolina. So we would go down there in the summer and see my grandparents, which is like a very different lifestyle where you're running around like fishing and hunting for frogs and, playing in the woods. So I got a good balance. Even my grandparents who had a house in New Jersey, when we'd go visit them, they backed up to like a big wooded area. So you could go in there and like dig holes and build forts and all that kind of stuff. So I had a good balance. And then we left the city when I was like 9 for like the suburbs around New York. So there was good woods to play around in there as well.
Do you feel at home in a big city or do you feel more at home in sort of more open spaces?
That's a good question. I think the best way I think about that is like when I'm in Denver, a lot of people who live here aren't from Denver and a lot of people who move here come from the surrounding smaller areas. And they're like, wow, Denver, the big city. But like a lot of people live in like single family homes and have yards in like the metro area. And I'm like, this isn't really, it's like a very large town, the way it's built and laid out. And like a lot of things close at like 9. There's not really like a late night scene. And I'm like, this is not really a city per se. So I guess that's really how it hits me. Like my expectation for a city is like Chicago, New York. maybe LA. But it is really nice when you're in like small town Colorado and you leave your bike outside on like not locked up and no one's going to take it.
Bike riding and city life and escaping to the country a little bit growing up. Something you did before this adventure of yours on the bike took off, though, was you're a trail runner, which is huge to me. I struggle, Spencer, to run a kilometre or two in a row without having to walk like an old nana or a grandmother for the next week. So I'm always amazed at people who can not just do a marathon, but run like ridiculous distances all in one go. How did you get into trail running?
Growing up, I played, like soccer and I ran track and field. And so just had like context for that. People in my life were like running marathons and stuff. So that was just always the thing I did and enjoyed. And then when I moved to Colorado, I got sucked into that bubble pretty hard. It's pretty easy when you start going to a run club and everyone's talking about their 50Ks or 100 milers. And I was like, I didn't even know these things exist. And then you surround yourself with people who are just doing those. And you're like, I guess this is just what people do. And then you like get lost in your little bubble. I think that's sort of how it happened. Just like proximity. I hadn't heard of any of these things until I moved out here. At the time, like the bike was just transportation. It wasn't really like a sport for me to train. So I had never really thought about like racing bikes or something like that. I didn't know anyone who did that as a kid.
And I guess also, like you said there, when you're surrounded by people making that the norm, it sort of, it sort of seeps into you slowly, doesn't it? And all of a sudden it becomes what you're thinking about and it becomes your norm.
Right. You run into those people at the run club. You go to like the touring Banff Film Festival in your town and people are all running crazy distances in those videos. And you're just like, oh, I guess this is just the next progression.
But even like there's trail runs and there's trail runs. Leadville 100. Now, I must admit, I know Leadville from like, mountain bike racing, which is ridiculously nuts. Sure. And I'm thinking, is the 100, it can't be the same course, or can it? I don't know.
There are parts that are the same. And then there are parts that you're not allowed to bike on. So they have deviations for that. I don't know how much is the same, but some of it is similar because some of the run is on like Forest Service roads.
To me, my mind boggles because not only is it an insane distance to be running, but the terrain there, like the up and the downhills too, because downhill running, it takes a different toll on your body too, right?
Yeah, that was pretty unpleasant. I think like half of the course elevation is in, like half of the elevation gain is in like a quarter of the course or something.
Brutal.
Yeah.
Did you finish the Leadville 100? How long did it take you to finish that to start thinking of maybe doing another one?
I had gone in hoping to run Leadville in like 24 hours and I ran it in 29:02 and the cutoff is 30. So after I had missed my goal while the race was still going on, I was complaining to my pacer about how we're going to have to do another one because I was not happy with the performance. And we weren't even done with the current one yet. So it was during the race.
Wow, you didn't even need rose-tinted glasses.
No, I was having like the worst day of my life. And I'm like, okay, we need to come back and do this better.
It's funny what different things motivate us, isn't it? I need to be better so I don't feel as miserable doing this thing that really... can you ever do an ultra and not feel miserable at part times of it?
I don't think so. I think that's part of the allure.
And I mean, that happens on a bike journey as well. You would know it better than most. Just the ups and downs of the emotional roller coaster of such a long bike adventure as well.
Yeah, the bike adventure doesn't hurt as much though. Leadville was pretty painful. I didn't train very well for that and it showed, so.
Like I said, Spencer, if I run 2 kilometres in a row, if I ran a mile, I'd be like a grandmother for the next week. In fact, last year, I tried to turn myself into a trail runner and promptly over the course of my first 3 runs ended up with like hamstring tendonitis, which meant I did walk like a grandmother for like about a month and a half.
So we're not going to see you at UTMB next year?
No, although I do have a friend, and actually previous guest of the show, hi Florence, who is hoping to do UTMB. And if she does, I have promised to be one of her support crews. So only as a support crew. Is that on your bucket list?
I might go and do it sometime outside of the event on my own. But no, not currently.
I am curious, Spencer, are ultras something that, like ultra running, that is something you want to continue doing?
Yeah, I would like to. I would like to go back to Leadville and do it better. The race was actually this weekend, so it was fun to watch people. And someone broke the course record, which is pretty exciting. if you live anywhere near the race, even if you don't run, go out and watch it. It's just one of the coolest things to be a part of. I know, like, even if I'm not running, I'll try to make it back every year to volunteer because it's a very special event. But yeah, right now my priority is, bikes, but I'd like to get back to Leadville one day, maybe the next couple of years.
We spoke earlier how biking was something you were doing as a commuter. And you've obviously taken this long distance bike tour, but have you also ridden bikes just for sport now as well?
I'm starting to get into that. I rode a mountain bike the other day for the first time. I got my heart rate monitor. I'm starting to train the bike a little bit. That's kind of exciting. I would like to get a little faster and just sort of maybe do some of the longer races like the Colorado Trail Race or something like that. Try it out, see if I like it. So that's why trail running is sort of on the back burner at the moment, because those things sort of all happen during the same season.
Tour Divide only just wrapped up. We're recording now, coming close to the end of August, but the Tour Divide only wrapped up just over a month ago as well.
Yeah, that one would be cool, but that seems much scarier than Leadville. Feels like Leadville, but dragging it out for like 3 weeks instead of just 2 days.
Yeah, see, like the Colorado Trail Race, that's the equivalent of like a runner's marathon, and then the Tour Divide is like taking it up a notch to an ultra, right?
Yeah, the Colorado Trail Race is still like 5 days if you have a great time. So
it's no slouch either.
No.
It's not like anyone can just ride a mountain bike and turn up to it. You need to be fit, and you really need to know what you're doing too.
It's funny how little road riding translates to like good bike handling on the mountain bike. I was having quite a time the other day. I was like, whew.
I always find it takes a few rides to get your like mountain bike mojo in as well. Like even if you've mountain biked a lot before, but then had time away from it, it always takes a little bit to get the cornering and the techniques right.
Right. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to spending more time on the mountain bike.
Colorado Trail Race. I wonder if that'll be a 2025 thing.
That's sort of my tentative right now. So we'll see how training in the winter goes and if I feel like that is reasonable.
Watch this space, listeners. Okay, before we get to 2025, let's rewind back to 2023 and half of 2024. This huge trip of yours, Spencer, I mentioned in the introduction, you got a thought about, like, the whole thing sparked in you when you read that article, and it sort of put it front in mind of, I guess, the climate crisis that the whole globe is facing and what impact that's actually having on our natural environment as well.
Yeah. I actually mapped this whole thing the week before Leadville because I was trying to just like sit at the computer and relax. It's just a funny overlap. But I had read that article at a time when I was thinking about taking a big gap from work and maybe going on a bike tour because I had a bunch of friends that like biked across the country and stuff. And I was like, I like riding my bike everywhere. Maybe this tour thing would be pretty cool. And that's sort of where that idea came from, was reading the article and thinking about, like, I'd love to see these places before they are so irreversibly changed. Driving and flying to all of them feels like I'm just speeding that up. Maybe I could ride my bike to all of them. What would that look like? And so I took all of the visitor center addresses, I put them into a trucking logistics software, and it showed me like the most efficient route if you were trying to drive to all of them. So that sort of gave me like the order in which I was going to visit them. And then I ended up having to do a little tweaking because I was going to originally start in Maine and go along the top of the US, down the West Coast, and finish in Florida. But the snow just wasn't melting out up north early enough. So I started in Florida, rode up so that snow was melted by that time, rode around and finished in Maine.
Can I just say, what a hack. Sorry, just for putting a huge route together. I've never thought of using like trucking logistic route mapping software to do that. Where did you get the idea for that from?
I think I just started Googling around and there was this guy, I can't remember what his website was, but he was like a sort of like one of those people who has like a lot of GIS and mapping knowledge and would make these fun like blog posts that were like most efficient Route 66 like cliche American road trip or like whatever. And so I found a bunch of his articles and messaged him, and he was like, the easiest way for you to do this would be to use this software. And they sold like day licenses where you could pay like $4 to use it for the day. And so I just did that, put all the stuff in, And that didn't give me like the route that I actually pedaled, but it gave me the order in which I would visit the parks.
Yeah, because I imagine the way that a motorized vehicle would take to go to these parks would be very different to the roads you would want to be on if you had alternatives as a biker, right?
Yeah, and then basically when I had the order, I would just use Komoot and put like the next place I wanted to go into Komoot and just do whatever they told me for the most part.
And you were talking there about having to deal with things like snow melt and those sort of considerations as well. I imagine factoring in for the seasons and the type of climate that you would get in different areas would have played a lot around with, I guess, where you started and where you wanted to be at certain times to avoid being in other areas at a totally inhospitable time to be there.
That was the intention and totally did not play out that way. I had driven all my stuff back to my parents' house, leave my car with them while I was on the road. And I was sitting in their house, like ready to go up to Maine, realizing that that wasn't going to work. I waited like a month, still wasn't going to work. So then I went down to Florida, but I should have left earlier because I got to Florida at like the end of the cycling season. So it was already getting hot. And then it put me too far behind where I ended up getting stuck in the Rockies in January instead of being like down in the desert Southwest. So I would have started like 2 months earlier and had a much different time. Less snow would have been in my future if I had started 2 months earlier.
So if anyone's out there listening thinking they'd like to do this similar challenge, your advice to them would be start in, because you started in April, I think, so you'd be advice to them start in February?
Yeah, go to Florida in February and then you should be fine.
And then, the earth says, hold my beer, I've got something for you. And
Yeah.
You'll get to Florida and there'll be something crazy will happen there, right?
Right. You wait to see what kind of snowpack there was the year before. Maybe things are closed longer than they normally are, or something's on fire. That was sort of the big thing. There was just so many variables going into this trip that I was just like waiting for a wildfire to shut me down, or waiting for an early snowstorm to shut me down, or it was just like couldn't really think too far ahead and just took it one day at a time, waiting to see what would happen.
I mean, it's very cliche, the idea of taking one day at a time sort of stuff, but it sort of works for a long bike tour as well. I've spoken about this with a few guests who've done huge journeys because sometimes just thinking about the end can be overwhelming as well because it's so far away. It can feel sometimes when we're on a huge trip that you can't get there. And I know we mentioned before we press record, Spencer, like your journey all up was over 29,000 kilometres. And listeners, like to put that in perspective, if you wanted to ride from Alaska to Ushuaia, that's the sort of distance we're looking at. If you want to go around the world, that's the sort of distance. In fact, I think the official distance to say you've cycled around the world is that distance.
Yeah, that's what Lael's doing right now for her speed record is 29,000 Ks.
She is, and she's nearly finished.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy nuts. But I guess it can be really overwhelming if you're, week 3 into a long tour to think that you've still got another 27,500 kilometres to go or something, Did you ever do that, though? Did you ever do that to your head, to your mind? Did you ever,
Oh, yeah. I would think of like this, oh, man, today was so long. And I would look at the map and then I would just keep zooming and being like, I didn't go anywhere. This is so comically far.
Zoom back in.
Yeah. You just look at it and you're like, wow, this is pretty messed up distance. I can't even understand how far this is.
I guess in America you would have like deserts where you wouldn't reach another place in the space of a day, wouldn't you? Because I'm saying this as an Aussie, and not that I have been there, but obviously we have people who go and ride, across the Nullarbor or north to south through the outback, through the dead centre, or WA, Western Australia, which is really, really remote compared to the eastern seaboard. And, you can go hundreds of kilometres between services. Did you have huge distances on your tour as well?
Our biggest gaps are nothing compared to what you guys have. I think for people who are familiar with like the Southern Tour route across the U.S., when you're in like the West Texas, New Mexico area, that's, I think, where the biggest gaps are, at least for me. You would see a sign that was like next services 90 miles, and then you just wouldn't see another structure. It's not even like, oh, I'll just go to someone's house and ask for water. Like there's just nothing there until you get to that like little gas station or visitor center or something at that town. So there was a period of coming from like Carlsbad Caverns down to Big Bend and then up to Austin, Texas, where it was like, do you want to have a 20-mile day because that's where the next water is? Or do you want to have like a 110-mile day because there's nothing in between?
What was your shortest day just randomly there?
Probably had several days of like 15 to 20 miles because camping in the national parks on your bicycle is like incredibly complicated and hard. And I usually tried to avoid it because it was expensive and highly regulated, and they don't have a lot of accommodations for people who are not showing up like in an RV. Those kinds of days were usually like I'd get right to the entrance to the park, camp on like the less structured like federal land that's usually outside the park, and then do the short ride into the visitor center, tour about all day, and then like ride back out. So those were usually when I had my shorter days.
Is that something you knew you were going to be doing before you set off, or is that something you sort of learnt that you needed to do because you were starting to see what the infrastructure situation was like, and also your own experience of what it was like actually camping, or prohibitive experience of trying to camp was like?
Yeah, that wasn't something I was expecting because I think a lot of people, when they think of the National Park Service, they would think that they would, find accommodations for people who are biking, or they're like, they have a lot of discretion to help you out, and you think they'd like be supportive. But I think post COVID, with like how many people are using these facilities, it's like everyone working there is very overworked, underpaid, places are understaffed, everyone's just fried. And so like, at least in my experience, there was very little willingness to be flexible because it seems like people working there are just dealing with people who aren't following the rules and, being just frustrating to them. So they were just like, these are the rules, take it or leave it, leave me alone. And so I was like, yeah, I mean, that's just where we're at. And that's a big part of like the advocacy work that I'm doing now, because I think it's like kind of garbage how much we prioritize big RVs over non-motorized visitors. And the National Park Service is doing a lot of complaining right now about traffic in the parks and how do we fix this. And all they're doing is like making timed entries. So you have to like get a permit to go into the park, but they're not doing anything to incentivize you to leave the car at home at all.
Which is sort of madness when you think of
Yeah.
listeners on the inside. My head is exploding at this idea. I'm very much the person you were describing, Spencer, that says, most people think of a national park and you're thinking of these places of beauty where you're going there to enjoy it. And in Australia, my experience of national parks, for example, in Australia is very much there are lots of campsites. They're very basic, but it's certainly not just geared up for people with, huge caravans and stuff. Like it's not that way at all. And in fact, there's a trail on the west coast in Australia, which I've heard great things about, the Mundabiddi Trail, and that is, I don't know if you've heard of this before, and if you haven't and you get into mountain biking, it's not super single track, technical. If you do ever look for something overseas to explore, check the Mundabiddi Trail out, because it's set up specifically also for bikers, with like hut systems and stuff that are set distances, and it's got, bike accommodation and everything. That's the way they're planning things.
That's very cool. Yeah, I'm hoping to see the National Park Service start to accommodate that a little bit better. We'll see. It'll take a lot of time. It's a car-centric country.
Did you have any examples of national parks which were doing that? Places we should be highlighting and saying, if you're going to this national park as someone getting there on a bike in the US, these are the ones to really seek out. They've got great infrastructure for you.
Yeah, Glacier is pretty fantastic. Glacier National Park, that's where like the classic Going to the Sun Road is. And that's a place where if you go in the spring, the road is not paved all the way, or is not plowed all the way. And so it's closed to car traffic, but cyclists are allowed to ride up there. And so you have the whole mountain pass to yourself. That's sort of like a big annual event that people get excited about. But it's basically just like riding across the park. It's a lot of climbing, a lot of being on this skinny mountain road. And there's a lot of campgrounds along the way, and they all have hiker-biker spots. So you can, if you're not having a great day, you can just pull off and camp there. You don't have to like make these reservations. They have that support for you, and it's well signed. Like there's a reserved spot. It's got a sign there. It tells you where to go. Whereas like some of these parks, they say they have a hiker-biker spot, and then it's not on any of the maps. It's not indicated anywhere. The camp host might not even know about it. And so then you're like having arguments with people, like it says it's there on the website, and then you can't pull up the website, and they're like, take a hike, get out of here. So Glacier does a pretty good job. It also has a shuttle that runs across the park. So if you bike to one side and decide you don't want to climb back out and do it again, you can put your bike on the front, take the free shuttle back. So they're doing a pretty good job of like showing you what is possible.
Yeah, so they're sort of like the gold standard, so to speak, in terms of this is how it can be done well.
Yeah, I still give them like a B minus, but they're our best example.
A B minus is the best example from someone who's just recently, in just, over 400 days, visited all 51 of them. I don't know how that makes me feel, Spencer.
It was like an A minus from my experience. Like they were almost perfect. And then I've talked to a bunch of people recently that have reached out to me and been like, because Glacier has these like weird nuances to a lot of their hiker biker policies that make them super frustrating. And people have just sent me like, I had this terrible experience, da 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 da, because of this like small footnote in the policy. I'm like, oh, they have like a good thing going and they make it overly complicated and hard for some strange reason. So I've been collecting those stories and we're going to reach out to the park and see if they can change their policies because they're very weird.
What would good look like, do you think? You're doing a lot of work now on that advocacy side of things. You've seen, first and foremost, what infrastructure is there, or more to the point, sounds like what's not there.
Yeah.
What would be the best way for them to start? What would you say this is the area that to focus on to get the best change to start to happen?
So there's like a couple things. You look at like how Oregon State Parks does their section of the Pacific Coast Bikeway, and their hiker biker campsites have these solar powered lockers. So you can like put your phone and your bike computer in the locker and charge those when you get there. They have a little covered shelter area so you can like cook out of the rain if you need to. They have food storage boxes. They have all these like very little things that make like a huge quality of life impact, making all the hiker biker campsites have those kinds of amenities as opposed to them being like some unlevel super garbage corner of the campsite that no one wanted. And then also the pricing, like the fact that in Yellowstone you pay almost $12 for a hiker biker campsite for one person, but if you want to go with your family you get a car campsite for $30 for 8 people. That's like a quarter of the price per person that the cyclist pays, which is just silly. So like that as well. And then other small things, a lot of the language in the little brochures you get at the park are all geared towards policing cyclists. So it's like ride single file, wear bright clothing, wear a helmet. It doesn't have anything about like give a full lane while passing, nothing for drivers. So that's another thing, sort of having a lot more, signage on the road, information in the brochures. Beyond that, redesigning the road layouts, because like I don't think widening the road is a great call to like add bike lanes, but maybe if we start changing some of the parks to be one direction, for instance, so like the loop in Yellowstone, if that was like a one directional loop, so you had 2 lanes of travel going in the same direction, so cyclists can be riding there and there's a place for people to safely pass them. Like you go to a lot of these parks and they have like oh, you're only here for 3 hours, here's how you do Yellowstone in 3 hours, and it's like, okay, we need to throw away that expectation, because then you get a lot of people who are speeding and they're in a rush and they have this like idea that they're going to do Yellowstone in 3 hours. And if you one direction the traffic in Yellowstone, that's now impossible. So I think this idea that when you go to the park, you're making a commitment to be there, to be traveling slowly and intentionally, and maybe taking shuttles between big popular hiking locations instead of like driving your own personal car and fighting over small parking spots because you're trying to do everything in 3 to 4 hours. So there's a lot of like attitude, cultural changes, we could make.
Yeah. Blows my mind to even think that a park like Yellowstone is something that you'd even consider doing in only 3 hours.
Right. And then to also expand the idea of like the hiker biker campsite to be hiker biker shuttle. So like if you fly into one of like, maybe you fly to Jackson Hole, right? And then if you took your bike and you got on a shuttle to Yellowstone that dropped you off at your campground, and then you had your bike to bike around, or like there were cheaper bike rentals, or you didn't have a bike at all, but there were shuttles that could get you to all the places you wanted to go, to expand, that as an option, because that's currently not offered at all in most places.
Obviously, you're putting together something. I mentioned in my intro, you've got a website, and listeners, I will put this in the show notes so you can see the work that Spencer's doing and get on board with it as well. If someone wants to, who's listening to this, they're from the US and they want to be part of a movement of change to try and improve the situation, what's the best way for them to do so?
I think right now a big part of it is the bike community just needs to get more organized. We have a lot of groups like, Bikepacking Routes, the East Coast Greenway Association, Adventure Cycling, and their main focus is on route building. and they have pretty small teams, and they're trying to make these pretty huge lifts of like making safe bicycle routes across the country. And that's a ton of work, but there isn't anyone whose mission is like improving camping access. Holistically, that's just their only thing. So that's what I'm trying to do. And so I'm working with these organizations and other transportation advocacy groups to just get organized and start throwing our weight around behind camping improvements. So we're working on a project right now in Colorado to get hiker biker campsites added to our state parks. So if people are interested, there's an email on the gobikecamping.com website. Reach out, let me know where you are, and I can figure out, how your help would be greatly appreciated. Because a lot of times it's just sending emails and building connections with people in your area who are in charge of these kinds of resources and showing them that a lot of people want them. Because I think a lot of the people making the plans and like they just have no concept. The bike community is great at like complaining to each other about this and not so great about complaining externally. And so if you're going on tours to places and they don't have these options, always fill out the comment cards, always send emails, have those conversations. Because a lot of times it's not that people don't want to accommodate cyclists. It's just they've never had that thought in their life.
Funny, at the other end of the spectrum, I remember randomly when I was interviewing Jen, who put together the Log Drivers Waltz route. This is in Canada. But something she and her husband did, and they put the route together, was for everyone that was riding this multi-day bikepacking off-road route, they gave them like little business card things. And the purpose was for them to give to service people, so people who were running the accommodation or running the eateries or running the bike stores or something. And it was purely to say, I'm riding the Log Drivers Waltz route and I am really chuffed at, what you're bringing, what I've been able to do as a biker, how you've looked after me and stuff. So it was also, on the flip side, actually letting people know that there is sort of value in looking after people that are on their bikes as well.
Yeah.
The bike tourism dollar means a lot to really small communities.
Yes.
And what it brings with it. And so letting people know the momentum that can be built on that as well.
Yeah, we plan to print sticker business cards kind of things with the same deal of like, this is what I'm doing. Like a lot of times on my tour, I'd, stop at a gas station or something, and the person working would be like, I always see people riding their bike through here. Like, where are they going? And I'd be like, oh, look, here's the map. Like, you're on the northern tier, or you're at a junction of these two places and people are trying to connect them. And so I want to have tools because, you meet those same people and they're like, oh, yeah, we have this grassy patch back here. You're more than welcome to camp here for the night. I want to be like, hey, Dave from West Virginia, do you want more people to stop and spend money in your store and spend the night? We can put you on this map and people will, then see you. So I want to have, the resources and stuff in place for that. So when people are stopped in there, they can be like, oh, if you want more people to spend money with you, like reach out to these people and set up a time to chat, and they can talk about how your business can plug into this community and what your offerings would need to look like, to make people prioritize stopping here.
Gosh, I want to get on board with it. I don't live in the US and I'd love to know a way of being able to support you on it.
I'd also love to hear from people who don't live in the States and come here to tour, to maybe ride the Trans Am, ride the Tour Divide, whatever. Because ultimately I want to expand it beyond camping to just have, if you're planning a bike tour in North America, this has all the information. So it'd have like local bike shops and it would tell you, like these people mend frames if you get hit by a car and need to fix your frame, or like this place always has bike boxes, or these train stations allow you to bring your bicycle boxed or unboxed, and here's what it costs. So like, I know there's a lot of, whenever you're going to another country and you don't understand like the cultural norms and those kinds of little things, you don't really know where to look. And so I want to make sure I have all that information for people who are coming to visit. So if people are planning tours and they have questions, please let me know. And I'd like to try to get those together in an FAQ for people.
I'm super excited. I think we haven't really even gotten into your trip yet, but already I can just see like the results of your trip and what you're doing as a cause of it. Like, it sort of circles back to the reasons of why you were doing it in the first place. Okay, I'm going to take a rewind back to route prep. You use the trucking logistics software to figure it out. You sort of figured out, but it didn't work out to plan the best place to start and end to try and get the best of the weather and the road conditions. And Mother Nature had a word or two in that regardless. There's an element where I imagine there's obviously national parks you know about, possibly ones you'd already been to that you may be excited to revisit, but there'd be ones you wouldn't have visited yet that you'd know about that you'd be excited for. I want to know, what were you really excited about, and what were your own personal milestones? What were the places you were looking forward to the most?
That's That's a good question. I think one of the classic spots I was excited about when I was planning this trip was seeing the giant redwoods in Sequoia. That's something I'd always wanted to see as a kid, and it was kind of cool to be putting this down and being like, all right, this year I'm going to get to see these trees. That's going to be cool. A lot of the other ones, like I'd been to Yosemite before, I'd been to the Tetons before. Those were places I was very excited to go back to because I knew they were going to be, super special. And then I think a lot of the time I just didn't have expectations for a lot of these places, or I knew the way I wanted to. There were already places while I was planning that I knew I wanted to go back. Like I knew I was going to be at Rainier outside of climbing season, and I know like I would love to go attempt the summit of Mount Rainier. And so while I was getting over to like Washington, I was like, I'm already going to be back here. I need to come back, another time for another trip. Right now I'm on the bicycle version of this trip. I would love to go back to Zion and do more canyoneering, but I was just like, I'm on the bike version of my time here. So a lot of times it was like, is there a road all the way through the park that I can ride and sort of see everything? Or is there like a big climb that I can do to get to the top? Or like, are there places people go riding that this is like the ride you go on when you're here? That was sort of how I thought about visiting a lot of these parks. But I was also really excited for a lot of the places they were going to take me, because most of the time on this trip is not riding in the national parks. And there are a lot of places in the country where I just had like no frame of reference for what I was going to see when I got there, which was pretty cool.
Gosh, it sounds ridiculous because I'm not a show that focuses on this specifically, but what was sort of like the biggest distance between parks? I imagine that there would be times where you're hitting a few national parks quite close together, but
Yeah.
then there would conversely be times where there's not another national park for ages.
I'd have to go back to my dates and look, but like I'd probably guess that there were periods where it'd be like at least 2 weeks before I hit another one. And then there were some times where it was like this week you're going to hit two, and the next 2 weeks you're going to hit four, kind of thing. They're not evenly distributed across the country, right? Like there are 9 in California, 4 in Utah, 4, I think, in Colorado. And so it's like, but then also like 3 in Florida, 1 in Maine, none in other parts of the country.
Did you come across parts of the country where you were like, why isn't this a national park?
No, not necessarily. The national park is like a strange, funny, nuanced designation. I think anyone voting for national park status at this point is, I think it's like a kiss of death for the area that you want to preserve, because it's going to get on the list. It's going to be part of everyone's retirement road trip. The little gateway town of 1,000 people is now going to see 6 million visitors a year. There's usually like a business interest backing the creation of a national park because they know there's a lot of tourism money to be made. There's a lot of development to do at the gateway communities right outside the park. There's a lot of other federal designations like national monument, national wilderness, all kinds of stuff that can still protect the land differently. It's like you look at the St. Louis Arch, it's now a national park, and that was completely political. It should be a national monument, but the people who donated to the renovation of the museum wanted to see more people coming to downtown St. Louis to spend money, and they were able to push Trump to make it a national park. And so now they're on the checklist and everyone has to go and people are going to spend money. We don't have like million-acre plots of land to protect anymore with the national park designation. And a lot of times, like, national monument does just enough, and you're not going to see the massive number of people show up.
It just struck me, and it was something I'd never considered, that of course there's people that are doing exactly what you did, but obviously in their caravans or their RVs as you call them in the States, and that's their road trip, is connecting a lot of these places too, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really funny to meet people at the parks who were like, driving their caravans to all these places, and they're like, "Oh, we love going to the national parks too. Like, you and me, we're the same." And I was like, I kind of like want your car to catch on fire, and I hope it never is allowed back in the park again. Like, we're not really the same. And it was also funny too because sometimes I'd only spend like a day in these parks because one, if there's 51 of them, if I spend the weekend in every park, that's like another 100 days on the trip, right? But it's not like the park boundary is where like the plants and animals stop. And so in the week leading up to this area, I'm sort of biking the same little forest roads and seeing moose and seeing bears and seeing mountains. The park boundaries might just be specific because maybe there's like a geothermal feature or a cave or something. So that's why the park is there. But you're seeing the same environment for, the week leading up to getting there and the week leading up to leaving that area. So people are like, you're only here for a day. And I'm like, well, I've been out in this for 2 weeks. Like, I'm just here on this road for a day. But it's not like you where you flew, drove, and sort of teleported right to here. Like, I've seen it.
It's the best part of bike travel for me is that you sort of feel the undulations of the terrain, you see the changes in your environment, and you hear everything and you observe, the birds in the sky, the wildlife, and
Right.
you hear the different noises as well. I mean, look, it's not all glamorous. There are times where you're in the shoulder of a not nice highway,
Yeah.
and all you're hearing is traffic
Yeah.
and breathing in is car fumes. Not every day is blue sky and rainbows, right?
Nope. That's correct.
If I was to ask you a question then, and I've asked it more recently, I think, of my guests, and it's about a phenomena of awe, like places where you are just feeling about the size of an ant because the grandeur of Mother Nature all around you just makes you feel so tiny, and you're looking at something almost wide-eyed going, wow. I imagine, Spencer, there must have been moments of awe on your trip. Can you tell me about a time where that sort of hit you?
The classic example, I think, and a lot of people probably feel this, is when you see the Grand Tetons for the first time coming into Jackson, coming out of Yellowstone. It's got to be one of the most prominent points, like in the U.S. They're just huge. It's flat, and then it's just the Tetons immediately, and they're so beautiful. And then you see them for a long time. Like, you're riding for hours, and they're just right there, unobstructed, gorgeous. And sometimes you see the Snake River right in front of that. That's a place I remember the first time driving from Denver to Jackson with my buddy to go visit his brother, and my face was just pressed against the glass the whole drive into Jackson. I was like, this is incredible. He was like talking to me, and I was just nonverbal for like half an hour looking out the window.
That's exactly that type of moment, yeah.
Yeah. But the same thing happens, the first time, even the second, third, fourth time you go to the Grand Canyon and you have a nice clear day and you see like the absolute scale of that place is pretty special. And a lot of like the desert Southwest riding when you're alone and you're like in some tiny slot canyon-y road and it's like silent and all you hear is like a bird and like the one tree that you can see is kind of rustling a little bit and it just feels like there's no one else like on the planet. That's pretty cool too.
Hey listeners, if you're loving the stories and adventures I'm bringing to you each week, consider supporting Seek Travel Ride by buying me a coffee. Your donation helps me keep the show going strong and bringing you even more inspiring content from our guests. Just head over to the Seek Travel Ride Buy Me a Coffee page. Every little bit helps and is deeply appreciated. Plus, it's a great way to show your love for Seek Travel Ride. I've included a link in the show notes. Thanks so much for being part of our community and for your support. Okay, now back to the show. You go through the emotional roller coaster sometimes on a long tour. And I wonder also, sometimes those moments of awe, they hit you right when you need a mental lift or you're fine, but then they hit you and all of a sudden you're like, I don't know, you've got tears or something going on. Did you have that sort of come across as well?
Yeah, there were a lot of times like that. I think the most concentrated for me was in the desert Southwest. I find that to be a very special place. And I love riding in the desert Southwest at night, which like people on tour, I know some people don't like to ride in the dark, but when you're out there and you can see like stars from the ground all the way to stars on the ground and you're watching like the Milky Way move through the night, I love that. Like my ride out of Big Bend was the same thing. It was a day where I got like 4 flats or something like that. So it just took forever. So I ended up getting to camp at like 2 a.m. The last like 4 hours were just me completely alone. Like I think like 2 cars went by. Otherwise it was just, high desert plains and yeah.
Did you ever have I mean, I know that it doesn't make the stars as vivid, but did you ever do that under the light of a full moon? Because that's mega.
Yeah, that's when I did. So the Going to the Sun Road through Glacier is pretty crowded, and I wasn't able to get there, at the right time of year to have an easy ride. And so when I was going through Missoula on my way to Glacier, someone pointed out to me like, hey, you're going to be there at the full moon. You should just wait and ride the pass at night. And so I got to the park and I just hung out at the bottom of the pass until like 9 p.m. and then rode up and over. And I think I saw like 3 cars, dead silent. You could still make out the mountains in the distance and see like the grandeur of the landscape, and you could hear the waterfalls pouring onto the road. So I highly recommend going to the Sun Road on a full moon if you have the chance.
I did that in Australia. We rode to the roof of Australia, I guess. Mount Kosciuszko is our highest mountain there.
Yeah.
And I left from a place called Charlotte Pass. And it was by full moonlight. And it got to a stage with the full moon on a clear sky where we could turn the bike lights off and just be totally lit up by the moon. And sort of you're casting your own shadow, and it should be pitch dark.
Yeah.
It was still one of the best experiences I've had on a bike. I felt like I nearly got hypothermia on the descent down because I was so not expecting how cold it was going to get, but it was worth it.
Yeah, I had to put on everything I owned for the ride down the other side because it didn't feel that cold until you're going as fast as you can and the wind's whipping on you.
Speaking of feeling cold, going through Colorado in winter, that would have been intense, Spencer. How did that play out?
Well, I have like a lot of experience with commuting in the snow here. So that was something like riding in the snow on the road is something I was already comfortable with. I do a lot of like backcountry skiing and like winter sports. So I had like the clothing for being cold. The thing that I noticed the most was that I had to start later in the day. Like I wouldn't start till like 11 a.m. because I wanted the sun to get over the mountains and sort of like thaw out the road a little bit. And then I was trying to get off the road by like 3 or 4 as the sun was setting and the road was starting to refreeze. Progress was slow since I didn't have a lot of time to ride. But I actually really liked riding in the winter. People were giving me a wide berth on the road because they knew, the road's kind of more dangerous. People were a little more like they weren't taking the chances they normally do. The Rockies are absolutely gorgeous in the winter. But the logistics were also funny because I had all the gear to sleep outside. Like I had a 0-degree sleeping bag from Feathered Friends, which was fantastic. And I knew that I could sleep outside anywhere, but I was also hitting up people on Warm Showers, the like cyclotouring website, to stay with them. And when I was planning, there's like a couple ways to go through the Rockies. And when I was planning it out, I was messaging people like a month ahead, like, hey, do you live here in the winter? Like people on Warm Showers, because I was kind of like, when you're in season, you sort of expect people who are on Warm Showers to be home because this is like the time of year they're expecting people. So I got a lot of funny responses from people of like, I'm here. You're welcome to stay with me. Good luck. It's going to be really cold. And a lot of hosts, have little guest books of everyone that stayed with them. And I had a couple people that were very excited in the morning to go out and take my picture in the snow because they're like, this is the only one in the book where, this tree here is not green and blooming. It's going to be covered in snow. So that was a lot of fun. It was entirely different from normal bike touring because the problems were just different. It was like I ended up wearing a cycling jersey so that I could carry my water bottles under my jacket against my skin and like my extra batteries and stuff so that things wouldn't just like die immediately from the cold. I had to deal with like my food freezing. So I would like sleep with my food in my sleeping bag. Like my cream cheese for my bagels would like freeze solid if I left it outside. So I'd like sleep with it. And there was like one night where I rolled over on it and like splattered it all over the inside of my sleeping bag. But then it like froze. So I was able to just like chip it off. It's just like a lot of the logistics and the challenges are different, which was like kind of refreshing because it felt like I was doing something different almost. And then once I got down to Phoenix and it was hot again, I mailed all the winter stuff home. And then it was sort of like, ooh, back to, summer touring and bigger, longer days and, being able to wear shorts. And so that was like reinvigorating and sort of broke up the tour.
It would be. And it would have been amazing as well. Oh my gosh, where were you where nature's, Technicolor leaf display was on in, well, I'm going to call it autumn, but in America you call it fall. Where were you for fall season?
I didn't get a lot of good fall because I was sort of on like the West Coast at that point and on my way down to the desert. So it was more like Joshua trees and evergreen trees at that point. I wasn't like in Maine or, watching the aspens change or anything like that.
No, I mean, you were sort of watching the country change, if that makes sense. Where you're riding to, and I guess your tour of the US isn't the typical tour route either. So you're seeing everything change along the way.
I guess fall for me was like realizing that it was going to be kind of cold at night and like having to pay a little bit more attention to the elevation. Cause like when it was the summer, it's like, oh, you can sleep up high. It won't be that cold. But the coming fall was like, ooh, it'll be, 30 Fahrenheit up here. But if I push, another 20 miles, it'll be 60 Fahrenheit down here by the ocean. And so that was sort of how I came to fall. Just like, how cold do I want to be at night?
It is one of those seasons, isn't it, where it's sort of heralding what extreme of cold and short days are about to come.
Mm-hmm.
Something I did come across, actually, Spencer, when I'm thinking, was it when you were in Colorado? Maybe it was somewhere else on your trip. There are a few times where you set yourself up for the night, like camped in like community, like public bathrooms or restrooms and stuff like that as well. And the thing that struck me there was that's a very ultra cycling trip thing to be doing. Like, when we were talking about the Tour Divide,
Right.
like you've got your experience there of bivvying in like the open public bathroom. Like that's a very ultra cycling type of thing to do. Did you had experience of doing any of that beforehand?
No, but that's like my internet bubble, seeing those pictures from people at the races. And I was sort of like, ooh, I'm going to cosplay as a Tour Divide racer tonight. And I'm going to ride to this trailhead and, get there. And there's like 2 feet of snow and there's like 3 or 4 bathrooms. And you can see that like no one's walked through this snow like all season. So I would just like pick one out of the way where I knew if someone did happen to show up, they'd have like another bathroom option. And I'm just going to sleep in this one.
I've not slept in a bathroom before, but I always worry that it's going to be like smelly. And if you're ultra cycling, you're that tired, you don't care. But
I did it in the winter, right? So it was like the least smelly time to be in the bathroom. It's not like it's roasting in like the 100-degree weather. It's like kind of frozen, so it doesn't really smell like anything.
pro tip, if you're going to do that, do it in the winter.
Yeah, and then you get the added benefit of like being inside out of the snow. So that was nice.
So from like bathrooms and stuff for your shelter, what was some of the best wild camp setups you would have had? What was phenomenal sort of place where you go, I can't believe I get to sleep here?
Well, there's like a lot of that in the US. It's just like so much nondescript public land, right? So like going through the desert, you just like pull off somewhere and you look at the map and see that it's like public land and you just set up camp like out in the middle of nothing. And you're like, wow, this is pretty cool. One of the more special campsites I had, so Petrified National Forest is or National Park, excuse me, is one of the only parks that has a gate that actually closes. Like, you can drive into Yosemite at 4 in the morning if you want to. But these have gates that close because they have a lot of like fossilized wood that you could like pick up and put in your truck or something and like take home and sell. And the parks were created to stop people from doing that. And so when you get to the park, like there is a closing time. And so I was getting there while the park was still open, but I wasn't going to be able to make it all the way through before the park closed. And so I was asking the people at the gate, like, hey, when I get through the park, like, will the gate on the other side, like, can I open it from the inside and get out? Right. And they're like, oh, yeah, totally. And I was like, okay. So I start my ride, I'm riding, and this ranger is coming through. He's doing like the last sweep of the night and making sure no one's still in the park. And he's like, hey, you're not going to get out of here before the gate closes. And I was like, well, I know, but I can get out. And he was like, no, you can't. The gate won't open unless you're like in a bigger car. It's like, magnets or whatever detect it and open the gate. And I was like, 3 other people I asked told me I'd be able to get out. And he's like, yeah, well, they were wrong. And there is like a backcountry camping area in the park where you like park your car and then you walk off into the desert. And he was like, I'm just going to give you an overnight camping permit and call it in, get up here. It's like 3 more miles down the road. And then you can just sleep there. And so I did that. And that was pretty cool because there was no, like the road was closed. So you didn't hear anybody driving by at night. It's pretty open, expansive, like rolling desert. So there is a highway that you can't hear, but you would be able to see if it wasn't like in a ravine. So it felt very like you're going back in time and then you were just sort of out there alone in the desert. So if anyone's cycling the Route 66 route, that's a pro tip. You could have Petrified National Park all to yourself if you, because then if you're there at night, you could ride the whole road out and back, which is like a 40-mile ride, and you'd have no cars and it'd be really pretty.
That's a pretty cool, unexpected moment to have, actually.
Yeah.
Just the park to yourself. Just even the thought, I've got this whole park to myself.
Yeah, the guy told me, he was like, there's no one, because it was like early season, so it was still cold, and he was like, there's no one registered here tonight, so you're the only person in here.
Even knowing no one else is around is pretty cool.
Well, it was a little annoying because you have to leave your bike up by the road and then sort of like walk down away from it. And there's like a little bike rack up there. And at first I was like, oh, I'm going to leave my bike up here and someone's going to drive by at night and like steal it. But then I was like, the road's closed. Like there's no way to get in here. The only person who would drive by here is like the park ranger responding to an emergency, and they're not going to steal my bike. So like I didn't even lock it up. I just like leaned it against the thing and then hiked down and everything was fine.
That would be a double take moment though, wouldn't it? Because your bike, when you're on a tour, it's your most prized possession. It's your home too, right?
Yeah, because at first he was like, got to leave the bike up here. I was like, I really don't want to do that. He was like, them's the rules. And I was like, okay, I guess this is what we're doing today.
But what an experience as well. On your trip, Spencer, you paused a couple of times, didn't you? Like you had some weddings to go to attend and you sort of put the trip on pause and then went back to personal life, family and friends, and then went back to it again. What was that like, sort of having a bit of a halftime show, for lack of a better way to say it?
Yeah. Well, that was part of the reason that I ended up in Colorado in January, because I didn't really calculate how long those breaks were actually going to be. But when I originally set out, I wanted to like, never get off the bike, see the whole thing all the way through. That was my intention. And then I got invited to some weddings through some good friends. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to like miss out on these great moments to just like ride around on my bike. Like there's no real merit or like reason there's no honor in skipping them to ride your bike all the time. But it was very strange. Like I had to go to to Italy for a wedding. And so I'd been like alone on my bike for several months. I left it in Fargo, North Dakota, flew back to my parents' house to grab my suit, flew from there to Italy, and was just like jet lagged, overwhelmed by all the people. And then like the culture shock. And it was just like very jarring.
Oh gosh, it would be. Where in Italy was the wedding?
It was in Tuscany. So I flew to Rome and then like had to rent a car with my buddy. Yeah. And it was like, now we're driving in Italy. And 2 days ago, I was riding my bike by myself in North Dakota.
That would have been interesting because I was sort of thinking, on a long bike tour, especially a solo one, you have encounters with people through the day.
Yeah.
So it's not like you don't have interactions, but most of your moments are on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are really good with that being the case and purposefully actually seek that out. They want to be like that.
Yeah.
And some people aren't so much. And I've always wondered when I've interviewed guests who've had something that's paused their trip and they've gone back, or they're visiting friends, or they've had an event they've had to get back to, what it's been like during that time, but also what's it like to return back to being back on a long bike tour. Because I've always wondered, if you're on a bike tour for ages and then you get that sort of injection of energy from your friends and family, is it really hard to leave that again to go back on your bike tour? Or is it a case like you were saying in Italy, you were sort of, had to snap yourself out of culture shock because you were so used to just being on your own riding your bike in places?
Oh yeah. After like 3 days off the bike at like the wedding breaks, I was like twitching to get back to the bike because there's just like the life is so much simpler. You don't have to make any choices. And it's like, I think that's what I was suddenly confronted with. It was like, now I'm going to Italy. I'm coordinating with people. We're making choices. What size rental car do we need? Which train are we going to catch? You're like planning out all of these things. And it was like very overwhelming. Whereas before the choices are like, I'm hungry. I'm going to stop. I'm tired. This looks like a nice place to sleep. And it's like, the choices are very like matter of fact and right in front of you.
There are also choices you're making for yourself as well. You don't have to have a group decision, which is just next level, right?
Oh yeah. It was pretty nice to only do what I wanted to do all of the time. To your point about like leaving your friends, during the breaks, I was always twitching to get back to the bike and very excited to get back. But there were a lot of times, like I met up with a lot of folks I hadn't seen in a long time on this trip. Just because, they'd moved to places that I wouldn't necessarily go on vacation to, but I was going to be riding through on the bike. So we were going to get to hang out. On those interactions, leaving was usually pretty tough just because the weeks leading up, you're like running towards this thing, which is like seeing my friends in Seattle. But then the next thing I'm looking forward to when I leave is maybe like 3 to 4 weeks away. And so it's like, I'm not running towards anything. I'm actually just like leaving a good thing. And it's not like I have to leave now to catch this train or this flight. It's sort of like I could leave today. I could leave tomorrow. It doesn't really matter. But at some point you have to like make an arbitrary decision to be like, okay, this nice moment is over and I need to leave. And it would take a couple days of like, that would kind of suck, where I was like, oh, I'm just sort of out here by myself. And then, a couple of days would go by and they'd be like, oh, okay, I'm back on the road, in this adventure again.
I was talking about being on your own and stuff. Was that something you had spent a lot of time, like had you taken many vacations, journeys, adventures, bike tours, whatever, on your own primarily? Like, was this a new experience for you? And you obviously talk now that you were comfortable with doing that, but was that something you had to learn along the way, or?
I had never done something this long by myself, but I'd had like, a couple month-long trips by myself before, very comfortable with that. I don't think I'd do a trip this long with like just by myself again, because it's a lot more fun to like do it with someone else and have that, I don't have anyone to call and like reflect back on the last year and a half with. There's people who are there for, a week or, a couple days, but no one who's like, oh yeah, I remember we went from Florida to Washington and like what that felt like. And that would be nice. So I'd like to do maybe the Alaska to Ushuaia ride one day, but I'm going to have to convince someone to come with me for that.
So doing a long trip like that is something you would legitimately think of teaming up with someone to do?
Yeah, it'll be totally different because this one was completely by myself. So there's like a very short list of people I'd want to do that with, and none of them really ride bikes at the moment. So got to find some new friends or convince them to start riding bikes.
You need to get them into that bubble, remember?
I know. They're usually like, they're runner people, and they're like, I run, I don't really bike. And I'm like, okay, I'll wait for it to hit you.
Jack Greenwood, the guest that I interviewed, now he rode Argentina to Colombia. He's a trail runner, and he did this tour. And he actually went trail running while he was in South America. So, maybe just suggest that episode to them.
Exactly. There you go.
It'll slowly sink into their minds as a cool possibility. Hey, wouldn't you like to go on this trip and we could take little breaks and go running along the way?
First, I've got to get them off the road onto the trail, and then from the trail to the bike, I think.
This is something you can work towards.
Exactly.
It is a fair question, though, and it's a theme that's come up with other long-term travellers as well, is most people are comfortable with themselves. That's not the issue. And the moments that they feel, I wouldn't even say it's loneliness, but they feel, I don't know if it's emptiness, I'm not sure how to describe it.
Yeah.
Is when they've experienced something that they wish someone was with them experiencing to be able to share it. Or they see something that they wish that their significant others or their loved ones or their family or friends were there to be able to share.
Yeah.
Actually, Jack, who I was speaking about there, he did part of his tour with a good friend, and his friend then left halfway through. And he was saying one of the best benefits of that is randomly they'll send each other a photo without context and just wait to see how long it takes before that person can go, oh, I remember where this was. This is what was happening and stuff.
That is cool.
So what have we got you down for now? Your Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, Colorado Trail Race, Tour Divide.
Right, there's a lot of things.
Alaska to Ushuaia. Before you know it, Mundabitty Trail in Australia.
Yes.
I mean, man, your calendar's booked out for the next 5 years.
Exactly.
Well, 6, because like Ushuaia to Alaska, surely you're going to take 2 years to do that, right?
Yeah, I would like to do that in 2. I think that's do some climbing along the way.
And speaking of time, this was a year and a few months, the whole journey for you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that was, and by the end of it, were you ready for it to be over? Or if you had to do this again, would you do it differently? Would you make it longer? Would you try and make it shorter? Could you even make it shorter?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up like the 411 days includes like almost 40 days off, 40 or 50 days off for like different breaks, going to Italy and Christmas and stuff. So, that's 2 months you could chop off if you didn't stop. Yeah, by the end, I was definitely done because I'd seen a lot of the like things I was really looking forward to. And now I was riding through like Cleveland and Buffalo and Vermont. And those places were all fantastic. I had never been to any of those places. I didn't have any expectations and I loved every minute of it. But it was a little different than like Yosemite or the Desert Southwest. I grew up in the Northeast. I'm familiar with what that area is like. It's just much more familiar. And on this trip, like this trip for me was like, I'm riding my bike. So I had a lot of like long days where it's just like 10 hours, 12 hours, just riding the bike all day. Cause that's what I wanted to be doing. If I did something like Alaska to Patagonia, so much of that environment would be new that it'd be a lot shorter days with a lot more side quests and a lot more just like hanging out in towns. Like I had a lot of fun in Cleveland. I could have spent a week in Cleveland, getting to know Cleveland, but I I didn't really feel compelled to spend a week in Cleveland, where like maybe if that was in Nicaragua and it was all very new, I might spend a week there.
When we're talking about side quests, because something that struck me is it's one thing to ride to a national park, but surely if you're going to a national park, you're there to also see the park. So you sort of arrive and then you're experiencing it. So there would be hiking involved and other things as well.
Mm-hmm.
With these side quests, I mean, for some parks, I imagine you know what you want to be doing. For others, you've never been to the park before, so you're not necessarily aware of what you could be doing. But what was something that you had pre-planned as a side quest that you were really motivated for?
Honestly, I didn't really have a lot of expectations just because I knew like a lot of things were going to be seasonally different and I didn't know exactly when I was going to be there. But also, I wasn't holding my breath on anything in case things were on fire and I wasn't able to get there to see them as I wanted to. Because I think until I was sort of on my way back east, that was like a big cloud hanging over me. It was like lightning can strike in the Cascades tomorrow, and then maybe you have to take a break until the fire's out, or you like just barely go into the park boundary and then go all the way around. So you technically check the box, but you don't get to see anything. So I wasn't holding on to anything too tightly. I knew like I wanted to go see the big redwoods and I wanted to ride my bike through the one that's like got a big tunnel chopped out in it. Like that was something on my list and I got to do that and that was cool. But there were a lot of things that like I just didn't know about. Like when I got to Isle Royal, a buddy of mine came up from Chicago and we rented a canoe and paddled around up there for a few days waiting for the ferry to come back and like take us to the off the island to the next continuation of the trip. What else? I'm trying to think. Oh, like Big Bend, there's a lot of hiking and stuff down there, but also just like staying alive on your bike is pretty tough because the distances are pretty large. So that just like that was just cycling. And then there's like Voyageurs National Park, which is like 99% water, and people are going up there to do like canoe trips into Canada or what have you, going camping on these islands. They have like a hiking trail that's like around the parking lot of the visitor center or something. It's like half a mile. So I wasn't gonna like rent a boat and go on a whole epic up there. So I just got up there, watched the film at the park visitor center, got some postcards, took a picture at the sign, and then I left. But it was one of those things where like it took me weeks to get all the way up to the US-Canada border, totally like out of the way to this new environment I'd never been to. And then to come down from that took weeks again to get over to North Dakota. And so it was like, that was very special. I got to see a lot of really cool stuff, but I was only in the park for, the afternoon.
Those exact moments you were talking about earlier where you're actually experiencing the nature either side of that. There's the park's at one point on the map, but you get to experience and understand the terrain either side of that as well.
Yeah, because like on my way up there, I stopped with a family on warm showers in like Ely, Minnesota, which was a very cool town. And that guy took me out on his boat. And so we got to have the whole like boating experience. And he had a big map of the boundary waters and was showing me all these epics people go on. And I was like, this is a whole world I'd never heard of before. Like, this is very cool. And so I got to like experience that without planning a trip to go canoeing for a week and a half in the boundary waters.
Unexpected moments are some of the best parts of a trip as well, because they are exactly that. They're unexpected. When you were talking about how you were planning the route logistically and where you were going and stuff, and it's such a huge route, my mind thinks that there's going to be times on that route which will be mega amazing on beautiful roads, no traffic. There'll be times where, because it's America, it'll be like hemmed in by cornfields maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But there'll be other times where maybe the route just served you this extra dose of misadventure that you didn't really necessarily want. I'd love you to take me to one of those days if you could.
Yeah, I think there's always like a learning curve when you start to use some planning software, So like the first 2 weeks I was using just Google Maps as bike directions, which are absolutely horrendous. I knew I was going to be out there for a year, so like I should stop being cheap and pay $60 for Komoot since I'm going to use it like 100 times a day. And so I did that. But then even then you have to learn the thresholds where like when you select cycle touring on Komoot, it's like, okay, we can leave pavement, but then what does that really mean? Because it's like, is it gravel?
It means you get commuted.
Yeah, is it single track? So then you start to learn like, okay, like when I was in Georgia, like that area, the dirt roads were like a lot of this sugar sand that you would just like sink into. And so Komoot would be like, we're taking this dirt road. And so I'm like, okay. And it's like kind of nice. And then suddenly it's like 4 inches of the sugar sand that I'm just walking through all day to get back to the road. And so then I'm like, okay, in Georgia, we're going to say that we're road touring only because I don't want any off-road detours. And sort of like, I don't know, there was a lot of learning those thresholds. But yeah, it took me a while in Georgia to understand exactly how Komoot was like making these decisions. And then I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and look, I've said this on a number of episodes. To be fair to Komoot, it's not just Komoot that does this. Ride with GPS could do this as well. All of them ultimately use OS maps, OpenStreetMaps. And so if it's marked as a plausible off-road route, it's going to send you down there.
Right.
And sometimes that can be a great thing. Like some of these off-road routes are fantastic and you want to actually use them. Sometimes you're in 4-inch deep sugar sand or like some of my other guests, sometimes it means you're bush bashing your way across a border through Albania.
Right.
I've certainly had an interesting one. Actually, the software I was using at the time was maps.me.
Okay, yeah.
It just told me to ride straight across a river. But we're not talking about a river that, you could walk a bike across. We're talking about like a river where you're coming from a height, so you would be dropping down 20 meters just to even try to get into the river. I'm like, there's no bridge here. And I think where it wanted me to join up to was a train line, but an actual train line, not a rail trail. Everyone's had these, haven't they?
Yeah, mapping is an impossibly tough challenge. And Komoot does a great job. You just got to start to learn how to couple that with like, you get your directions from Komoot. Then I would look at Ride with GPS's heat map and be like, do people who live around here normally go this way? Or like, why is Komoot not taking me the most direct way? And then you look at like satellite images and Street View on Google Maps to see if the road is paved or not, because sometimes Komoot doesn't know that. So it becomes more of like an art than a science.
Everyone has its quirk. It's funny, because of where I live in France, it's very popular for the Tour de France to visit here as well.
Okay.
A couple of years ago, I was training for an ultra cycling event, and so I was trying to find new big loops and, bigger rides. And also this was really relevant too when I was actually... my ultra had to map my route out. Like you had to connect checkpoints, but it was up to you how to do it. It wasn't like on a fixed route, which FYI, there's fun in that. But if I ever do one again, jury's out whether that'll ever happen. I'm only going fixed route because it's just a nightmare.
Oh yeah, it's a totally different event.
Oh, totally. But the curveball, so I ended up using Komoot and Ride with GPS, and Street View is just the absolute godsend for that as well when you really want to see what you're doing there. But initially for my training rides, I was using Strava, and that was great. Except their heat maps for where I live in France have also been pretty skewed because Tour de France riders get to ride here and they post to Strava. So then Strava thinks that people bike ride on roads which you're not allowed to ride bikes on. It's like
the interstate.
I can't go here.
That's funny.
That's a very unique problem, though.
Yeah, the tour riders should have to flag there. It's just like it's e-bike, on Strava. It's like, was this an e-bike tour? Was this a segment for the Tour de France?
There isn't a perfect solution yet, but I think what you were talking about, though, before, the good thing is to use a combination. It's not to use one in isolation as well.
And then to also talk to people. So, like, another thing I would do is if I was doing if I was going from like Seattle to San Francisco, for instance, like I would just Google Seattle to San Francisco bike ride, because you'd think like, oh, this is sort of common. Like that's the Pacific Coast Bikeway. But like if you picked other cities in the US, and you'd think like, oh, a handful of people who live around here have probably done this ride and then probably wrote a blog post about it or like posted their routes. And then you can like find that information. Or like if you go to a bike shop and you ask, like, oh, do people ride to the next major city? How do they normally do it? And people would like pull up Google Maps and show me like, this is how we recommend doing that.
That is a really great, super hot tip for that, actually. How would a local ride here? Because the locals ride the best way, generally.
They would also tell you like, hey, this is going to double the length of your time and it's absolutely worth it to go all the way out there and see whatever is out there.
Oh, I realize this is so off cuff, but I want to know, can you remember something that was that case where someone said, this is taking you ages, but go there, it's worth it?
Yeah, riding from Las Vegas to Zion National Park, there's like a couple ways you could go. You can like get right on the interstate and like fight for your life, and they're like, people do that, it's not recommended, and usually they're like, I'm never doing it again. Then there's like more direct routes, and then I think it's the Lake Mead recreation area. If you go through there, that's like a lot longer, but it was gorgeous and there was like no traffic. And then eventually you meet back up with the more direct routes and you're back on the roads again. But that was a way that Komoot wasn't telling me to go, that a guy at the bike shop that I asked was like, do the detour to the lake. It's a lot nicer ride.
Yeah. Is that something you'll take forward then if you're traveling somewhere? Like you'll seek out the local bike store and just find out what are the local tips there?
Yeah, usually I wouldn't like make a thing to go to the bike shop, but if I had to go there to buy tubes or do something already while I'm in there, I'm going to ask for as much information as they can give me. I had a lot of great success with just like what I was saying, like Googling. Like if I Googled like Las Vegas to Zion bike ride, like there's somebody who's posted that on Strava or Ride with GPS or written a blog post about it. And those were always winners. They were pretty good.
Speaking of bike stores, going there to pick up spare tubes and whatnot, I imagine you would have had punctures, but did you have any mechanical issues at all on this journey?
No, I had like a very uneventful, ride in that department, which was fantastic. The worst mechanical I had, I was like on this rural road in Texas and I got a flat. I go to take my axle out and it just snaps. And so now I just like I can't get the wheel back on. And so I'm like, huh. So I like fixed the flat. I'm sitting there. Yeah, luckily I have cell service. I Google like, closest bike shop. It's like an hour drive away. So it's pretty far. And then I'm like, all right, well, let me see if they even like are open because, Google Maps data isn't always accurate on that. And like if they even have what I need. And so I call the shop. I start talking to the guy. They're going to be open. They have what I need. And I just, tell him I'm broken down on the side of the road. He's asking me where I am. And I told him I was like 5 miles past this like really tiny, like one stoplight town. And he was like, oh, I actually live there. So he commutes like 45 miles to his job. And he was like, if you want to hang out for like 6 hours, I can just bring it to you after work. So I was like, sure. So I just sat down on the side of the road. There were like some horses, in a pasture. And like eventually some guy up the road, like who lived in a house, saw me just like walking up and down the road. And so he came down and chatted with me for a few hours. And then as the sun was setting, this guy showed up from the bike shop. I did the switch and I had wanted to do like 60 miles that day and I only did 20 and I was like, I don't really know where I'm going to camp. And then they were like, oh, there's this like little town camping area where people go fishing that like doesn't show up on Google Maps. You have to like know it's there. So then they direct me to that, which is only like, 5Ks away. So it was very easy to do. And so it was a fantastic little day of hanging out. And that was like my worst mechanical of the trip.
It's like a serendipitous bike failure, isn't it?
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
What bike did you use, by the way?
I had a Surly Straggler. I learned a lot about bikes on this trip. And now I didn't have opinions before. I always just bought beaters on Craigslist. And now I have a lot of opinions. Don't go long distance touring with the Straggler. Get the long haul trucker. There's a reason that those bikes are different. The frame geometry is a lot more comfortable on the long haul trucker. I couldn't position my bags well enough on the Straggler to stop the like handlebars from wiggling a little bit. So that was like an almost near constant. If I took one of my hands off, it would be like,
Yeah. You get that weird sort of wobble.
yeah.
I always thought that was just because things weren't balanced right.
Well, so I couldn't, with how big I am, how big my feet are, and how tight the frame was, I had to sit the panniers past the rear axle of the bike, which is when it creates the wobble. You sort of want to get those centered on the axle, from what I understand. The chain stays on the long haul trucker are longer, so you can position the bikes there and then have clearance, or position the bags there and then have clearance for your feet.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. But another
Yeah.
Surly. I could have had a Surly. In fact, I would have had a Surly Straggler. And I changed my mind last minute. And I've always got like a soft spot for it. But anyway.
Well, I picked it because it was cheap and the only bike my size on Craigslist. So
They are, legitimately though, they are a pretty good damn bike though.
it was fantastic.
Look where it took you.
Yeah. The only other issue I had was I didn't really know much about like wheel sets and weight and stuff. And so I had a period of 6 broken spokes where the bike was overloaded and, me plus all that weight was too much for the wheels that I had. And so eventually when I had a break, I called Velocity and talked to one of their reps for a while and picked out like exactly what I needed, had that mailed out and put on the bike and never had any problems since. So that was self-inflicted and I should have just gotten a burlier wheel set. So if you're going on a long tour and you don't know if your wheels are strong enough or not, you should just look into that. Save yourself a lot of heartache.
Sometimes it's a lesson you want to learn from someone else first, right?
Yeah.
Spencer, 411 days on this trip, including breaks, but 411 days filled with big moments, no doubt, as well. Something I do ask all my guests to do is to share what it was like exactly on one day of their trip. Funnily enough, we were talking about Jack Greenwood earlier, and it was him that told me this is the question he always thinks that people should ask someone who's done a long distance trip, because people finish a journey and people go, oh, what was your trip like? And when it's so big, you go, well, where should I start? But it's pretty easy to tell them about one day.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed hearing the guest stories, and I'm looking forward to now. I'm asking you this. Where are you going to take me and the listeners for one day of this big national park tour bike adventure of yours?
I was going to ask you if there was anywhere in the country specifically that you were most curious about.
Oh my gosh. Well, see, you know when you were talking about redwoods?
Yeah.
I'm a huge photography lover, right? And specifically landscapes. I'm a cloud lover and I love big sky magic. And so what you're talking about, you know, the desert southwest, I can picture myself there too. And I'm sort of wanting you to tell me about that. But I'm also a massive tree lover and I've always wanted to see redwoods and sequoias and stuff like that for myself. So I want you to take me to one of those places.
All right, we'll go to the redwoods because it'll make bike touring sound super magical and marvelous and skips a lot of the less pleasant parts. But riding through the redwoods, so the way California is, there's sort of like hills on the coast, hills in the middle. There's like the Central Valley, like Sacramento area. So to get to the redwoods was waking up at some sort of campground in the Central Valley, which is like it's just farmland is how you would picture it. And it was just an entire day of slow, steady, like 5-mile-an-hour climbs up these little roads. And luckily I was there in a shoulder season, so it was just like no one really there. So, you know, you start out being able to see the Central Valley, and then your day is just like progressively grander and grander views as you look out behind you and how far you've climbed. There's like no services because you're just in the woods. There's like, it's not even like nice, big, new McMansion-y houses. It's like old school, tiny cabins because you're just like so far, like you're not near ski resorts or anything like that. Eventually you make it to the top. You get to the visitor center in Sequoia. Sun was setting. I went into the visitor center, bought some snacks. I don't have a lot of options there. And then made it to the campground loop. This was a hilarious evening, but I get to a campsite and something... I rarely had a fire, but that was the beginning of fall where it was going to be cold and I wanted to sit outside for a little while. And so I had a fire. I walked to all of the other fire rings that weren't occupied and just sort of scooped up all the little wood that people had either purchased or collected and made my own little pile. And then I had dinner, had the fire going, and I just laid on the picnic table and watched the like flames sparkling off the big trees. And I'm laying there just sort of taking in the scale of the whole thing, thinking about how these trees are like thousands of years old, you know. And out of the corner of my eye, I see these very weird lights coming up the road where like you'd expect to see like car headlights, but they were kind of like a bunch of scattered small lights. And it took me a second to realize that it was like 3 cyclists with headlamps and handlebar lights on. I realize they're cyclists. And so I'm just like, hey, do you guys need a place to stay? You can stay with me. And it's so dark that I can just see their lights and they're only, you know, like 3 meters away. I can't see like their face or anything. And then one guy starts talking to me and I realize it's this guy, Alex, who is from the UK. He and his brother were doing the Alaska to Ushuaia ride. We had met in Yosemite a few days later and parted ways. We didn't know we were going to the same place. We hadn't really talked about it. So then they ended up staying with me. And then the campground at that point was full. And so we're up, it's like midnight now because we're all excited, hanging out. And this car comes through and these folks were on their way to Joshua Tree for like a conference or something. They were like they worked in the environment or something. And since we weren't using the parking spot at our campground, they asked if they could just like park and sleep in their car that night. So then they came over and joined us. And we're talking about how like they're big surfer people and they're on their way to Joshua Tree. And so we're all up to like 2 a.m, have this very serendipitous social day. And then the next morning was just waking up and deciding that I was going to ride with the Brits for like, those guys were British, like riding with them for like a week because we were sort of headed the same direction. And so we ended up riding through, that was the day where we got to ride through the cut up redwood, and you'd climbed the whole day before. So this day was mostly just descending like hundreds of meters eventually. And we had this amazing sunset ride out of the sequoias down to the campground at the bottom. So that was one of the highlights. People asked like where my favorite place of the trip was, but so much of that was good weather and the people that you met. Like that same day could have just been like rain, very antisocial and like completely unpleasant, you know?
It's interesting. I had this, and hang on, before I go on to that tangent, what a day, by the way.
Yeah.
I always joke, Spencer, that if my podcast was to happen in real life, I would call it Bella's Campfire Chats, and I'd have bike travelers around a campfire, because that'd be the best way to hear these stories, right?
Yeah.
Over a few hours, campfire, and it'd be a clear night, you could see the stars.
Exactly.
But so much of what makes a day good are moments. It's not necessarily, location can help, but like you said, if you have bad weather or if you're not feeling great for some reason or another, it clouds the area. It's more about those moments. And I was having this discussion with very previous guests, Arev and Matthias. They're people who left from Germany and have gone all the way around the world. And I was sort of just saying to them randomly, you know, what's been your favourite country so far? And their answer was, it's really hard to say because it changes because of different experiences and different moments and, you know, how you're reflecting as well. It's so true.
Like that riding was one of the coolest days. And now I happen to get to do it with some people who I keep up with. And so you have someone to be like, hey, remember this? And like, you know, someone else saw it. It wasn't just a dream. And that's pretty special. I feel lucky to have met someone at that exact moment.
Where are they now in their journey?
Last I was looking, they were in like Peru.
Wow.
Yeah.
I need to stalk their social media.
It's funny because I was getting ready for work this weekend and I was talking to them and they're like, you know, in the back of some truck going over some mountain pass in like the Andes. And I was like, damn, you're still out there. I need to wrap up this working thing and get back to my bike as quick as possible.
Well, that is a question I had for you. When your journey was coming to an end, was it the sort of thing where were you conflicted? Was part of you really wanting it to end and part of you sort of not?
I had gotten everything out of this trip that I had wanted by the end. And so the last couple months was very much like I wanted the satisfaction of like checking all of these boxes more than I needed some sort of like spiritual experience or to figure out the answer to some question, you know? And so it was just like head down, ride, try to make it to the end. And there was like the very big satisfying payoff of like being done. And I think there was a sense of like being free from the trip. Like it had been so much of my thinking and just life for the last couple of years that I was like, it's done. It's been wrapped up. I'm excited for what's next. Yeah. So I think that's how I finished the trip, which was nice.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because if I reflect on what you were saying there, you know, with the Brits and you're sort of hearing about their experiences and thinking, gosh, I need to wrap work up and stuff. You're probably thinking of it, reflecting about your time with them, having such an amazing time, and also thinking, I would like to have a trip with a whole heap of people having such an amazing time as well.
Right.
Maybe you convince them to go the other way.
Well, they were just texting me and they're like, have you thought about a New Zealand, Australia trip? And I was like, guys, when you're done, let me know what you're up to.
The Mundi Biddy's calling your name. No,
yeah, I know. I think that's in the stars.
New Zealand and Australia would be absolutely mega. Would you visit every national park in them? Is that something you would ever do again?
I don't know if I'd go searching for that title specifically, but I'm sure there's a lot of things in those parks that are like absolutely wonderful, and I'd be going more for those and less the parks. I think that's another funny thing. Like people ask me a lot about the parks, and I think they provided a great framework for a trip. But some of the worst times of my trip were in those places because of just how horribly laid out and car centric they are. And so there's a lot of them that I have no need to go back to. And also because they're just so crowded because people just want to do the easy to digest trip itinerary. Going to Yellowstone, that's very easy to understand and you can have your hand held through that entire trip. Whereas there's tons of like public land around those parks where you can just go on like a great, you know, romp by yourself and make it all up. But people don't want that. They want the showers at the campsite and they want all this other stuff. So I wouldn't go to such built up places in the US again. I don't know what they're like in Australia and New Zealand. I'm sure they're fantastic.
When I think about what you're talking about there, I think about the national parks I've been to around Australia, and there's infrastructure around some of them, but they're mainly just vast sort of. Some of them I would say are just vast wilderness areas.
Yeah.
A lot of them sadly burnt. Not on the east coast, we lost a lot of our national park areas to huge bushfires. Now it's the Australian bush which does regenerate, which is an amazing thing to witness. But we lost a lot of our wildlife and stuff.
Yeah.
I think of my most special times in the parks, and they've not been anywhere near the main. It's all like certain locations, and Australia and New Zealand will fill your cup.
Yeah, I'm excited. Have you seen Lachlan Morton's alt tour video where he like bike packs the Tour de France? That's also on like my back burner. Like that would be a really cool way to go to France. His stats from that ride are messed up, and it's a crazy amount of fitness to do it that fast. But like, it'd be cool to go do all the famous climbs and see France from that perspective.
Actually, you want to give yourself a real challenge. A previous guest of mine, Max Schnell, he did a challenge called the Do Mill Challenge. So he rode every paved mountain pass over 2,000 meters in the Alps and the Pyrenees, which was absolutely mental and ridiculous. Max, you're an amazing beast of a champion. And the reason I mention him is because I think a couple of years beforehand, it might have even been the year beforehand, he rode the Giro Tour and Vuelta routes plus transitions all back to back to back as well. Happy to put you in touch with him, but that is someone else who's sort of done the Lachlan Morton style of thing, that if that's what you're keen to explore, there's definitely options for you.
It seems cool because it's like, like Lachlan says in the video, but it's like you have all these other, like the World Cup and all these places. You can't just like go to Wembley, but you can ride the climbs in the Tour, like that's pretty cool.
You can, and you can think about the history that took place there and stuff like that as well.
And then when you watch it on TV, you'll be like, oh, I know what that feels like. And then you can laugh even harder at the stats of how fast they're going.
Yeah.
Up the
How did they
mountain.
do 40 kilometers up here? If I'm doing 17, I'm doing well.
Exactly.
Spencer, I need to wrap this up, which is always hard for me because it's always just such a joy to speak to people and chat about adventures like yours. I know that I will have people who want to dig into your story and search what you're putting together there in the hiker-biker space as well. What's the best way for people to keep up with you and your future adventures?
Yeah, on Instagram, it's at SpenceXYZ. And then the website, gobikecamping.com, is constantly being updated. And there's going to be, I'm going to add an advocacy blog shortly of like what projects are being worked on and how people can get involved. And if you just have any thoughts or questions or things you want to see included, I want to make this a resource that is like helpful for people. So there's an email on the website, and you can, or DM me on Instagram. I want to hear everything that, would make this super useful for you.
Fantastic. And listeners, get on board. As Spencer said, it's not just US people. It's also people who want to visit and, get the most out of these places too. And from a bike adventure community here at Seek Travel Ride, I know there's many of you that will benefit from what's going on here. And I think it's the power in numbers is behind your movement there as well, Spencer. So I will provide links to all of those in the show notes for you to seek it out. Alrighty, Spencer, we are well and truly in the wind down now. 3 questions to finish the show, all quick and all ones I ask all of my guests. The first one is music themed. As a guest of the show, you get to go on the Seek Travel Ride music playlist. It's a playlist that's, it'll 4.5 hours long. Each song has been chosen by a guest to represent their bike adventure. So it's a very cool, eclectic mix. When you hear it, you go on their adventures. What song are you choosing to represent your bike adventure?
Okay, so some quick context for the song before I tell you. On the way into Chicago, when you're riding through Illinois, it's incredibly flat and all just like industrial agriculture. So there's no one out there. And yeah, it's very flat and straight. So on my way to Chicago, I actually had my phone on my handlebars, and I was watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which takes place in Chicago, and was just getting in the mood for being in Chicago. And the song that he's singing a lot during the movie is Dankeschön. And that song just ended up on my on repeat on Spotify and sort of stuck with me the rest of the trip and gave me my, Ferris Bueller inspired day off energy when I was out there. And it would come on at the most random times. So if you haven't seen the movie, watch the movie so you have the context for the song. But yeah, that would be the song.
There'll be a lot of people who have seen it. But who sings that?
Oh my God, you think I would know it like 1,000 times I've heard it. Wayne Newton. And Wayne Newton sings a lot of stuff. You might not recognize his name, but if you go through his other stuff on Spotify, you've probably come across it before.
You were down. And listeners, you can check out the Seek Travel Ride music playlist on Spotify and Apple Music as well. All right, second last question, Spencer. You're giving a choice one day. You can choose to ride forever in one direction, which will take you up a constant, never-ending hill climb. Or you can choose to be turned the other way. It won't be a hill climb, but it's going to be a constant, never-ending headwind. Which one are you going to choose?
Oh, the climb for sure. There's a sense of satisfaction in the climb that does not come with the headwind. The headwind is just, for me, a constant frustration and you never win.
Yeah, and I imagine you had your fair share of headwinds, right?
Yeah, I had a decent amount. There's one in Florida that I remember was so bad that I was like standing up in the saddle and going like about the same speed I would be walking. And I was stuck on this 7-mile long bridge coming out of the Florida Keys. So you're just on the shoulder of a road. So you couldn't even like pull over to stop. And there's a park right at the other end. And I got there and I just laid behind the bathroom building out of the wind for the whole day. I was like, I can't. This is too much.
Oh, the other days where you nearly give up.
Yeah. And that was like week 2.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it never got worse. So that was nice because I was always like, oh, it's not as bad as that one day.
You always have a day. Every bike traveler has this. Everyone has like, it's like a measuring stick of crappy windy. Like, well, it's bad today, but it's not this bad. Yeah.
Exactly. Like I survived worse.
Final question for you, Spencer. You've got a choice one day. You're going to ride your bike. It's just for 4 hours, but would you choose to ride your bike for 4 hours on your own or for 4 hours with other people?
That's a good question. So much of that depends on, I feel like, how I wake up in the morning and if I want to have a really hard day or a very social day. But right now, I think it would be with groups of other people because I've done enough 4 hours plus riding by myself. And there's some new rides here in Denver that I've never attended that I'm looking forward to going to this week that are sort of like that 2 or 3 hour social rides.
I figured you would choose the social pick for this when you were recounting that story from Redwood and also saying how your next big trip you want it to be with people. So I was thinking, is going to be a social rider. Like you're comfortable riding 4 hours on your own. But yeah, okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
Very, very good.
But it's fun how much faster you ride with other people for like the perceived effort, you know, because you're just like talking or having a good time and suddenly like, oh, wow, we're actually moving really well. And it doesn't feel like we're working like that. You're
right. And time goes quickly too. Like 4 hours, it'd feel like 1 hour.
Yes.
Unless it's not great company.
Yes. Yeah, unless they suck. Or it's all on the highway and you can't talk to anyone.
Or it's a headwind and you can't actually hear what they're saying because all you can hear is the wind, right?
Exactly.
Well, Spencer McCullough, it has been an absolute pleasure to swap time with you today, to hear you share your story and learn more about this monumental bike adventure of yours. Like we said a few times, 29,000 kilometres up, down and all around and across the US of A. All those 51 national parks are ticked off. There's no doubt going to be so many of them that have got a forever impression in your mind. Some of them you'll return back to. And I hope that when you do, that you see changes in their hiker-biker facilities and that the groundwork that you're putting into now is going to pay dividends in the future. It was probably something you'd not thought much of before setting off, and it would be just probably the most fantastic legacy of this ride to be able to reflect back on. All of which to say, thank you so much for sharing your story and experiences on the show here at Seek Travel Ride.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was so fun, and I hope to run into you in France sometime.
Totally. Come to the Pyrenees. Lots of mountains here.
I know. It's a cool place to ride.
Well, listeners, I hope, like me, you were transported on a fantastic ride all around the US. Spencer's recollection of some of those landscapes just sounded magnificent. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me was something that he said quite early on, where it's not so much the national parks themselves that he was sort of looking forward to going to. They were almost like a tick box by the end of the trip of what he needed to tick off, get to, so that his personal challenge was done. But it was the days of riding either side of being in those parks, that environment all encompassing around it and just being in that beauty. Clearly, the desert landscapes there were ones that really held Spencer's heart, and the moments of awe I could just imagine. But also just those beautiful little moments, the unexpected things, you know, being the only person to be able to stay overnight in the petrified forest. Like, what an incredible time he had. I definitely encourage you to go and check out his website, because I feel that what Spencer's putting together there is going to be a really helpful resource for all of us bike travelers to use, especially if you're going to be cycling anywhere in the US. I've put a link to it in the show notes, and otherwise it is called gobikecamping.com, and Spencer would definitely welcome anybody who would be able to help out with providing any information that could go towards the site as well. Now, if you are enjoying Seek Travel Ride, you definitely want to sign up to our Seek Travel Ride newsletter. In it, I let you know who our upcoming guests for each month are going to be, a little bit of their backstory, and also provide updates from within the Seek Travel Ride community as well. To subscribe to the newsletter is really easy. Just click on the link in the show notes and you will get Seek Travel Ride news delivered to your inbox each and every month. Until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.